There are jobs that sound unremarkable until you're actually doing them. Night security at a cemetery is one of them. On paper, it's just walking a perimeter, logging rounds, making sure no one's spray painting headstones or leaving beer cans near the older plots. It sounds almost peaceful. Some people probably imagine it's peaceful. They haven't done it. What happens to a person when they work that job long enough isn't something that translates well in conversation. The cemetery changes on you slowly. The silence changes. The dark between the stones starts to feel less like absence and more like something that has weight and presence, its own slow patience. And then sometimes something specific happens, something you can't file away, something that follows you home and sits in the corner of the room while you try to sleep. The accounts you're about to hear come from people who worked those hours, who walked those grounds, who noticed things they weren't supposed to notice and couldn't stop noticing after that. Take a moment, breathe. The rest of this story unfolds in your mind. Now, put on your headphones. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I always find it interesting to know who's out there and when. Story 1. The first time I noticed it, I didn't think much of it. That's the part that bothers me now, not what I found, not what came later. The part that bothers me is how easily I explained it away that first morning and walked back to the gatehouse and poured myself a cup of coffee and sat there thinking about literally nothing. My name is Marcus. I'm not going to say where exactly, but it's a cemetery on the south shore of Massachusetts, founded sometime in the 1690s. One of those places where the oldest stones are so weathered you can barely make out the letters. Some of them are thin and crooked like bad teeth. The cemetery covers about 11 acres, which sounds like a lot until you're walking it at 2 in the morning and it feels infinite. I took the overnight job because the pay was decent, and I'd been between things for about 8 months and I needed to stop being between things. My girlfriend at the time, Dana, she thought it was funny. She said I always did like being alone. She meant it as a compliment, but I'm still not sure it was. The shift ran 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. 3 perimeter walks logged at midnight, 3, and 5:30. In between, you were in the gatehouse, which was a small heated room near the entrance with a desk, a monitor showing the 2 security cameras at the front and back gates, and a coffee maker that took about 12 minutes to brew a pot and made a sound like it was in physical distress the whole time. I'd been there maybe 3 weeks when I first noticed the plot. Section D, which is one of the older sections toward the back of the property. The stones there are colonial era mostly, small families, a lot of children, which I never fully got used to seeing. The grave I'm talking about is marked with a flat rectangular stone, gray granite, very simple. The name on it is Elias Croft. The date says 1887. I don't know much more than that about the man, and honestly, I'm not sure knowing more would help. The first morning I noticed it, I was doing my 5:30 walk. The sky was just starting to get that gray-purple quality it gets before the light actually comes. I came through Section D and saw that the ground near Elias Croft's marker looked disturbed. Not dramatically. No gaping hole, nothing like that. Just the grass and soil at the near end of the stone, roughly where a head would be, was raised slightly. Lumpy, like something had pushed up from underneath and then subsided. I walked over and looked at it for a moment. I prodded the soil with my boot. My first thought was animal, some kind of burrowing animal, mole maybe, or groundhog. The soil in old cemeteries can get loose over the years, especially after rain, and we'd had rain 2 days before. I made a note in my log. Section D, Plot 14, minor ground disturbance, possible animal activity. And then I walked back and made my coffee and didn't think about it. The next morning, it was the same. not identical. The disturbed area was slightly larger, and now there was a visible crack running maybe 6 inches along the edge of the stone where it met the ground, like the earth had shifted slightly. Again, I noted it. Again, I filed it away as settling, or animals, or some combination. I didn't say anything to Ray, who was the day supervisor. I'm not sure why. I think partly I didn't want to sound like I didn't know what normal cemetery maintenance issues looked like because I was new. And partly, this is harder to explain. It just didn't feel urgent yet. But on the third morning, I stood there longer. The disturbed area had grown again. It now spread across the entire near end of the stone, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet. The crack along the stone's edge had widened, and there were now 2 smaller cracks branching off from it. And the soil itself looked different. Not just displaced, but turned, like it had been moved deliberately, not from above. The surface wasn't dug into. It was raised from below, and then flattened back down, but not quite flat, not quite settled. I stood there in the early morning cold and I looked at it, and I thought about the mole theory, and I thought about the settling theory, and I looked at the shape of the raised area, and I thought about how the shape was approximately, roughly, the width of a person's shoulders. I told myself that was a stupid thing to think. I went back to the gatehouse. I wrote it in the log. I made my coffee. But that morning I didn't drink the coffee. I just sat there with it in my hand, going cold, while the cameras showed me the empty front and back gates in the gray early light. I want to go back to something I mentioned, the way the soil was raised but then flattened. What I mean is, it didn't look like something had come up and stayed up. It looked like something had pushed against the underside, hard, and then stopped. Or been stopped. And by morning, whatever pressure had built up had subsided, and the earth had settled back down, but incompletely, like a bruise from the inside. I'm aware of how that sounds. By the end of my first month, I had noted it in the log 11 times. The physical pattern was consistent, discovered at the 5:30 walk, not present at the midnight walk. Whatever was happening between 3 a.m. and 5:30. I started doing an unscheduled walk at 4:15. The first time I did that, I came through section D, and there was nothing unusual. I walked the whole section, came back, stood near Elias Croft's stone for a moment. Everything was still. I felt slightly stupid. It was cold in a way that was getting into my collar, and the sky was that deep black it gets around 4 in the morning before any light starts coming, and there was no wind, and the whole cemetery was just still. The way a room goes still when someone in it has stopped breathing. I walked back. The second time I did the 4:15 walk, I was halfway through section C when I heard something. A sound that I have thought about many times since and still cannot fully describe. The closest I can get is the sound of earth moving against itself. Not the surface. Deeper. A slow, dull, grinding displacement, like soil contracting around something that was expanding. It came from the direction of section D. I stood where I was. I didn't move toward it. I have thought about that since too. Why I didn't move toward it immediately. I think it's because the sound had a quality to it that made my body decide something before my brain caught up. My body said, "Stay here." The sound lasted maybe 8 seconds. Then it stopped. I stood in section C for probably 2 full minutes. My hands were in my jacket pockets, and my right hand was around my flashlight, which I had not turned on. I don't know why I hadn't turned it on. I just hadn't. Eventually, I walked into section D. Elias Croft's plot was disturbed again, worse than any previous morning. The raised area now covered the full length of the stone and extended maybe 8 inches beyond the far edge. 3 of the 4 corners of the stone were visibly lifted from the ground, tilted slightly inward. The cracks had multiplied and were now a network across the near end of the plot. And on the surface of the stone, on the flat face that pointed upward, there were 2 long marks that ran parallel to each other, maybe 3 inches apart, scored into the surface of the stone, not deeply, but visibly, like something had dragged across the underside of the stone from inside, like fingernails. I called Ray at 6:15. I told him about the disturbance, kept the log notes professional, said I thought there might be some structural issue with the plot. Ray said he'd take a look. He came out that morning and looked at it for about 2 minutes and said the ground settling was consistent with the age of the plot and they'd have the maintenance crew look at it. He didn't mention the marks on the stone. I'm not sure he saw them. I didn't point them out. I don't know why I didn't point them out. That night I went in at 10 and did my midnight walk, and everything in Section D was calm. Everything was flat and still, and the stone sat the way it always sat. I did my 4:15 walk and stood in Section C for a while before going in. I heard nothing. I walked into Section D. The ground was flat. The stone was level. I stood there and looked at it for a long time. There was a thin, cold drizzle starting, and I could feel it on the back of my neck. The stone was wet and gray, and the name Elias Croft was cut into it in the plain block lettering they used in that period. I crouched down and ran my flashlight along the surface of the stone. The parallel marks were still there. They hadn't deepened, but they were still there. I put my hand on the stone. I don't know why I did that. It was cold, the way stones are cold when they've been sitting in night air. Just stone. Just cold. But there was something else. Very faint, almost below the threshold of what I could call a sensation. A vibration. Too slow and too deep to be my own pulse. I took my hand off the stone and stood up and walked back to the gatehouse. I quit 3 weeks later. I told Ray it was the hours, that my sleep schedule was wrecked, that it wasn't sustainable. He said he understood, said they'd miss me, gave me my last check without any trouble. I never told him about the vibration. I think about that sometimes. Whether telling him would have changed anything. Whether not telling him means something I did wrong. I don't go to cemeteries anymore. I know that sounds like a punchline. It isn't. What I think about specifically is the timing. The disturbance always happened between 3 and 5:30. Every single morning, without exception, whatever was happening. Whatever was pushing against the earth and the stone from underneath. It happened on a schedule. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it means anything. But something that happens on a schedule is something that expects to happen. Something that has been doing it long enough to have a rhythm. That's the part I can't let go of. Not what it was. The fact that it had a routine. If you're still listening, you already know this story isn't going to end the way you want it to. The next account came to me through someone who had heard a similar story at a trade gathering for grounds maintenance workers. He reached out to the person directly, and what follows is as close to verbatim as I can make it from the recording that was shared with me. Story 2. I worked nights at Perkins Hill Cemetery in central Connecticut for about 1.5 years. You want to know the honest answer to why I took a cemetery job? My brother-in-law managed the place and he needed someone reliable, and I had just gotten out of a relationship and I didn't want to be home at night. That's the whole story. No mysterious calling, no weird fascination with death. I needed something to do between 10 and 6, and this paid reasonably, and my brother-in-law was going to owe me forever, which had its appeal. Perkins Hill is mid-sized, probably 300 plots, mix of old and newer sections. The old section along the east wall is pre-Civil War. The stones there are that thin gray shale type, really crumbly. My brother-in-law David, He was always worried about those ones. Any hard freeze could crack them, and then families call, and it becomes a whole thing. I settled into the job pretty well. I'm not someone who gets spooked easily. I grew up in a house where we didn't do ghost stories because my mother thought they were stupid, and some of that stuck. Dead is dead, she used to say. They don't bother you. You bother yourself. About 4 months in, I started noticing the grave. Old section, east wall, right up near the corner where the wall and the iron fence meet. The stone there is actually a decent-sized slab, lies flat rather than standing upright. Name on it is Margaret Hollis, died 1849. I want to say she was in her 40s when she died, but I'd have to check the records, and I haven't gone back to check anything. The first thing I noticed wasn't the ground, it was the leaves. In October, we get a lot of leaf fall, obviously, and part of my job was just keeping an eye out for accumulation in certain areas, drainage, that kind of thing, so I was paying attention to where leaves were piling up. And I noticed that on the flat stone over Margaret Hollis's plot, there were never any leaves. The adjacent stones, the ground all around it, leaves everywhere. But the surface of that stone was clean, every morning. Now, wind can do funny things around walls and fences. There are weird little eddies, and you get one area that collects leaves and another that stays clear. I know that. I've seen it. I told myself that's what it was. But then one night I came through and there had been no wind. Still night, no movement anywhere. Leaves sitting exactly where they fell. And the stone was clear. I thought about raking some leaves onto it deliberately to see what would happen. I never did. Looking back, I'm not entirely sure why not. The ground disturbance I noticed about 2 weeks after the leaf thing, similar to what I later heard others describe. The soil at the near edge of the flat stone raised and disturbed, mostly at the head end. Not dramatically, but consistently. Every morning when I came through, I poured myself into rational explanation. Old cemeteries have a lot going on underground. Roots, animals, drainage issues, the slow, inevitable process of things decomposing and contracting and settling. I had no reason to treat this particular plot as anything other than a maintenance issue. Except, one morning in November, I came through at about 5 a.m. during my last walk. It had been a cold night, temperature dropping, and there was a very light frost starting to form on the grass and on the surfaces of stones. That kind of delicate frost you get just before dawn, the kind that makes everything look slightly unreal. I came around the corner toward the east wall. The frost was everywhere, on the grass, on the fence, on every stone and every surface in that section, except the flat stone over Margaret Hollis's plot. That stone was dry, not just clear of frost, warmer than its surroundings. You could see it clearly in the early light, the way frost stops right at the edges of the stone like a line. I stood there and looked at it. I had my flashlight. I pointed it at the stone, and there was no frost on the surface, and the edges of the frost on the surrounding ground were clean and distinct. I thought about what produces heat in a confined underground space. I didn't finish that thought. I just walked back. Something I haven't mentioned yet. Around this same time, I started having trouble sleeping during the day. I know that sounds like it might be unrelated, but I'm not sure it is. I'd come home at 6:30, get into bed, and every time I got close to sleep, I'd get this image. Not a dream exactly, more like a thought with a texture to it. A person lying in a dark, closed space. Not in distress, just lying there, waiting. I want to be clear about something. I was not frightened of that image. It didn't feel like a nightmare. It felt almost ordinary, like remembering something that hadn't happened yet. That's the part that still bothers me. I went to David one afternoon and told him There was a plot in the east section that had consistent ground disturbance, and I thought they should have someone take a look. He nodded and said he'd put it on the schedule. A week later, I mentioned it again, and he said the maintenance crew had looked at it and found minor settling consistent with the age of the plot, and it wasn't a structural concern. I asked him if they'd noticed anything about the temperature of the stone. He looked at me in a way that made me not finish the question. I put in my notice in January. By that time, the disturbances had been happening every single night for about 3 months, regular as anything. And every morning that stone was warm when everything around it was freezing. My mother's voice in my head the whole time. Dead is dead. They don't bother you. You bother yourself. Maybe she was right. I don't know, but I think about one specific morning in December, one of the clearest cold mornings I can remember, when I crouched down and put my palm flat on that stone and felt the warmth of it and thought, whatever this is, it isn't finished. Whatever it was still working on something. I hope it's finished now. Before the next account. Where are you right now? What time is it where you are? Leave a comment. I read them, and if these stories are the kind that stay with you past the time they're over, consider subscribing. There's more waiting. Story 3. My name's not important. Call me Dale. That's fine. It's close enough. I did ground security for a cemetery outside of Newburyport, Massachusetts, right near the coast. That's relevant. The air there is different. There's always moisture in it, always a low-level smell of salt and old wood and something organic underneath. The cemetery has been there since the 1700s. Some of those families, you see the same surnames on stones across 300 years. I was the kind of person who liked night shifts in principle and hated them in practice. I'd think, quiet, I'll bring a book, I'll listen to podcasts, and then I'd get there and the night would be so completely quiet that putting headphones on felt wrong. Like I'd be leaving myself vulnerable to something. So I mostly just walked and listened and logged my rounds. I want to tell you about September and October specifically. 2 months, because that's when it happened. About 3 weeks into the job, end of September, I started noticing a grave in the northwest section. Old part of the property right up against a stone wall that borders an old orchard that hasn't been worked in decades. The trees press right up to the wall, and at night they make this constant slow sound. Not quite wind in leaves, more like the trees themselves are settling against each other. You get used to it. Mostly. The grave is marked with a standing stone, unusually tall for its era, carved with a willow and urn motif at the top that was common in New England colonial graveyards. The name is Samuel Arcott, 1798. The stone is one of the better preserved ones in that section, which I used to think was because of its protected location near the wall. What I noticed first was the smell. Not immediately apparent. Not something you catch from a distance, but if you walked up close to the stone, within maybe 4 feet, there was a smell. Earthy, yes, but with something else under it. Something almost animal. Not decay, exactly. More like the smell of something alive in a small, closed space. The smell of breath, a little. Of warmth and exhalation in a contained area. I mentioned it to the other guard, a guy named Pete, who worked the weekend shifts. He came over and smelled it and said it was probably a dead animal in the ground somewhere nearby. He wasn't wrong as a theory. I accepted it. But the smell was there every night, stronger on warm nights, lighter when it was cold. If it was a dead animal, it was the most persistent one I'd ever encountered. The ground disturbances started in early October. Consistent with what I now know are similar accounts from other locations. The soil at the head end of the plot raised and disturbed overnight, discovered at the early morning walk, undisturbed at the midnight check. The raised area grew incrementally over several nights. The sides of the stone worked slightly loose from the surrounding earth. I want to tell you about one specific night because I think about it more than any other. The third week of October, I was doing my 4 a.m. walk. I'd started doing these unscheduled walks because I couldn't sleep in the gatehouse and I wanted something to do. Cold night, clear sky. The stars over that part of Massachusetts on a cold, clear night are something else. You forget how many there are until there's no cloud cover and no light pollution, and the sky just opens up. I was in the northwest section, maybe 20 feet from Samuel Arcott's stone, and I stopped. Not because I heard something, because I didn't hear something. The trees. The constant soft sound of the old orchard trees moving against each other. It had stopped. There was wind. I could feel it on my face, feel my jacket move. The wind was still there, but the trees had gone completely silent. I stood there and felt the wind on my face and heard nothing from the trees, and I felt my chest do something complicated. I've had anxiety in my life. I know what it feels like. This wasn't the same. This was something more specific. The feeling of being watched by something that didn't care whether you knew it was watching. I turned toward the stone. The soil at the head end of Samuel Arcott's grave was raised about 3 inches above grade, more than I'd ever seen. The sides of the stone were visibly lifted at the near corner, and there was steam, very faint, barely visible even with my flashlight, but rising from the disturbed soil. The kind of steam you see when warm earth meets cold air. Warm earth. I want you to think about what produces warmth underground. I stood there for a while. I don't know how long. Long enough that my feet got cold inside my boots. And I thought about what it means that this happens every night, that whatever was producing that warmth, whatever was raising that soil and loosening that stone, had been doing it every single night, not trying to escape. That was the thought I had. If something was trying to escape after this many nights, it would have made more progress. The stone would be fully displaced by now. The soil would be more dramatically disturbed. This wasn't something trying to get out. This was something that couldn't be still. Something that moved because it had to. Because lying in a space that small for that long had made stillness impossible. And every night it pushed against whatever was above it, not to escape, but because it didn't know how to stop. The trees started again, just like that. The wind, the soft sound of branches, like something had exhaled. I finished my walk. I wrote in the log. I went back and sat in the gatehouse and drank cold coffee and thought about the difference between trapped and just unable to stop. I worked there until the end of November, left for a better paying job, nothing dramatic. But every night between September and November, without a single exception, Samuel Arcott's grave was disturbed by mourning. Every single night. I've thought about what I should have done differently, whether I should have escalated more, pushed harder for an investigation. I didn't, and I'm not going to pretend I know exactly why. Part of it was this. I don't think an investigation would have found anything. I don't think there was anything there that could be found by the methods investigation uses. Some things don't leave evidence, they just leave a feeling that you carry with you and can't fully put down. The smell, mostly. That's what stays with me. On nights when I can't sleep. And there are more of those now than before. I sometimes think I can smell it. That enclosed, living smell. The smell of something breathing in a small, dark place where the air has been breathed too many times already. I keep a window open now, even in winter. I don't want to think too carefully about why that helps. There are more accounts like this one, stay with me. The next account was shared in writing, typed out over several separate sessions according to the person who sent it. You can feel that in the way it reads, like someone who had to keep stopping and coming back. Story 4. This is going to take me a minute to get into. Bear with me. I worked overnight security at Millbrook Cemetery in southern Rhode Island for almost 2 years. Longer than anyone else who's had this job recently, from what I understand. I outlasted 3 people who came before me and 2 who came after. I don't say that like it's an achievement, I'm just noting it because I think it means something about what those other people encountered and how they handled it versus how I did. My name's Sandra. I was 43 when I took this job. I'm 46 now. I look at photos from before and I can see something in my face that changed, and I'm not sure how to describe it, except to say that I look like I've spent a lot of time thinking about something I can't resolve. The cemetery is on the edge of a small town that used to have more going for it economically and doesn't anymore. You know those New England towns that look nice, but feel like something is winding down. Not abandoned, just slower and quieter than it was. Millbrook is like that. The cemetery is on a small rise at the north end of town, surrounded by a low iron fence, mature trees around the perimeter. I need to tell you about myself a little before I tell you about the grave, because I think context matters. I am not someone who has ever believed in ghosts. Raised Catholic, lapsed heavily, currently in the category of agnostic about most things, and trying not to think too hard about it. I have had 0 experiences in my life that I would call supernatural before this. I'm a methodical, detail-oriented person. I like order. I took the security job partly because it's very ordered. Do this walk, log this time, repeat. The first 6 months were completely unremarkable. The grave I'm going to describe is in the east section of Millbrook, in a row of stones that dates to the 1840s. It belongs to a man named Orrin Wheeler. The stone is simple, the carving minimal. Name, dates, that's it. Nothing unusual about it visually. There are more dramatic stones in his immediate vicinity. I first noticed it in spring, about 7 months in. Mild disturbance at the head end of the plot, soil raised. I logged it. Maintenance looked at it. Animal activity was the determination. The disturbed area was smoothed down. By the next morning, it was raised again. I'm going to be methodical about this because that's how I experienced it. As a data problem. What was the disturbance? How large? How consistent? What conditions preceded or followed it? Frequency. Every night without exception for the entire remaining period of my employment. Location. Always head end of the plot, expanding over time to include a section roughly 2 feet wide by 4 feet long. Timing. Always occurred between midnight and 5 a.m. Midnight walks showed nothing. 5:30 walks showed disturbance. I started doing additional walks specifically to narrow the window. By doing walks at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., I eventually established that the disturbance reliably appeared between 2:30 and 3:15 a.m. That's not animal behavior. Animals don't have that level of schedule consistency. I logged all of this. I presented it to the day supervisor. He looked at my logs and said he appreciated my thoroughness and the maintenance crew would continue to monitor the situation. I want to tell you about the night in August when I was doing my 3 a.m. walk and I came through the east section and the disturbance was in progress. I didn't see it starting. I came around a row of stones and the ground near Orrin Wheeler's marker was moving. Slowly, incrementally, the way water rises. The soil at the head end was lifting, a centimeter at a time, with a very faint sound like compressed material releasing pressure. And the stone was tilting slightly at the near edge, lifted by what was happening underneath. I stood 12 feet away and I watched it for a long time. This is the part I have never said out loud to anyone. While I watched, I became completely calm. Whatever the rational response to that situation should have been. Alarm, the impulse to run, the impulse to call someone. I didn't have any of those. I just became very still and very calm, and I watched the ground move, and I thought, with a clarity that still unnerves me, it knows I'm here. Not threatening, not malevolent, just aware. Whatever was down there, in that moment, it knew there was a person standing nearby, and it wasn't trying to hide, and it wasn't responding to my presence by stopping or escalating. It was just continuing, going on with whatever it was doing, like I was just part of the night. I stood there until the movement stopped, maybe 5 minutes total. Then the soil settled back down, slowly, incompletely. The stone tilted back, but didn't quite reseat itself. And the east section of Millbrook Cemetery was quiet again, and I was standing there in the dark with my flashlight in my hand and the feeling of having witnessed something that didn't have a name. I don't know what I think happened in that cemetery. I've had 2.5 years to think about it, and I still don't have a theory that satisfies me. What I know is that something happened in that plot, consistently, on a schedule, for at least the entire period I was employed there, and probably longer. What I know is that standing there at 3 a.m. watching the earth rise and fall, I felt. And this is the word I keep coming back to, the only word that fits. I felt observed. Something was aware I was there, not in a way that changed what it was doing, just in a way that made it clear the awareness was real. I left the job because the day supervisor told me my fixation on that particular plot was becoming a concern, and that I needed to either accept the maintenance department's assessment or find a different position. I found a different position. I drove by Millbrook Cemetery last spring. I don't know why I did it. I didn't stop. I slowed down and looked through the iron fence at the east section, and from the road I could see. I couldn't be sure. It was daytime. But the stone that marks Orrin Wheeler's grave appeared to be slightly tilted, like it had never been fully reseated, like the ground beneath it never quite settled. Before the next account, take a breath. If something in these stories has settled wrong with you, leave me a comment and tell me what it was. Tell me what hit hardest, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. There's more coming. Story 5. I've never written anything like this down before. My sister keeps telling me to talk to someone professionally, and maybe she's right. But every time I think about actually sitting down with a therapist and describing what happened at Hollow Ridge Cemetery in Vermont, I stop, because describing it requires me to say out loud that I believe what I think I believe, and I'm still not ready to fully do that. So I'm saying it here instead, anonymously, to an audience of strangers in the dark, which might be easier actually than saying it to someone who knows my face. I worked at Hollow Ridge for about 8 months, night shift, late summer through early spring. The cemetery is in a valley about 12 miles outside a small town. I won't say which, and the nearest house is almost a mile away. Nights there are truly dark in a way that I hadn't experienced before. No ambient light. On cloudy nights, it can be so dark that you genuinely lose your sense of distance and depth. Your flashlight becomes the entire world. I was hired in July. By October, I had developed what I can only describe as a complicated relationship with one specific grave. It's in the old section, marked with a carved stone in decent condition. Name Caleb Marsh, died 1872. The stone has a carved hand at the top, the pointing finger style that was common in that era, meant to indicate the path to heaven. The hand points upward. The first wrong thing was the grass. A small detail. I noticed in late August that the grass directly over Caleb Marsh's grave was greener than the surrounding grass, more vigorous, growing faster. The grass over the adjacent plots was the same dull late summer green, drying at the edges. The grass over his plot was deep and dark, and growing at maybe twice the rate, so that it was consistently longer than the surrounding area. I mentioned this to the caretaker when she came in one morning. She said some areas have better soil composition, that's all. I said, okay, but what makes grass grow faster? What's in the soil that promotes that kind of growth? I knew the answer to that question. I didn't pursue it further. The ground disturbances started in September, same pattern. Head end of the plot, raised soil, loosened stone edges, consistent occurrence overnight between the midnight and 5:30 walks. I logged it every morning. The thing that separated my experience at Hollow Ridge from anything I've heard from others was the sound. Late September, 2 a.m. walk. I came through the old section and stopped before I reached Caleb Marsh's grave because I could hear something, not the sound of earth moving. I heard that later. This was different. This was a sound that, if I had heard it somewhere else, in a different context, I would have called breathing. Slow, deep, rhythmic. Approximately the rate of breathing during sleep, coming from below the surface of the ground near his stone. I stood still, and I listened to it for what I can now estimate was about 2 full minutes. It didn't change. It didn't speed up or slow down. It was just there. Underneath the September night in a Vermont valley, with no ambient light and no other sound, there was something that breathed like a sleeping person. I left the cemetery. That was the first and only time I left my post mid-shift without being replaced. I drove to the parking area of a gas station about 3 miles away and sat in my car until the sky got light. I went back for my last 3 hours of shift and logged it as a personal emergency. I came back the next night. I don't know why. I think partly because I wasn't ready to accept that I was the kind of person who ran from a sound. The sound was there again the following night, and the night after. By the end of September, I had heard it 11 times. I began to accept it as part of the night's texture, the way you accept any repeated thing eventually. I still didn't approach closer than about 10 feet, but I stopped leaving. In October, the sound changed. Nothing dramatic, still slow, still rhythmic, but the rate changed. Sometimes faster, sometimes slower, in a pattern that, over several nights, I began to recognize. The way you might recognize a pattern in something you've been listening to long enough. 3 slower breaths, 2 faster, pause, repeat. The night I recognized the pattern was the night I stopped trying to explain it. Because patterns aren't random. Patterns are produced by something that is doing the same thing in the same order. What underground process, gas, settling, hydrology, produces a consistent patterned sound that changes rate in a repeating sequence? I stood 10 feet from Caleb Marsh's grave at 2 a.m. in October, and I listened to something underneath it, breathe in a pattern, and I thought, it's been doing this for a long time. This isn't new. This is something that has been doing this every night, probably for a very long time, and the only thing that's new is that there's someone here to hear it. I want to be clear about one thing. I never felt, at any point, that whatever was there wanted to harm me. That's not the right frame for what it felt like. It felt indifferent, or past the point where wanting anything was a relevant concept. Whatever it was engaged in something that was entirely its own, had nothing to do with me, and would continue with or without my presence. I gave my notice in early spring and moved back to Maine, where I grew up. I sleep with music now, not because I'm afraid of quiet. I've never minded quiet. But there are certain rhythms in pure silence that my brain has learned to find. A particular cadence in the absence of sound that I now hear whether it's there or not. 3 slow, 2 fast, pause. My sister says it sounds like trauma. She might be right, but trauma requires something to have happened to you. What happened to me at Hollow Ridge happened underground, underneath 30 inches of soil and a stone marker, and had nothing to do with me. That's what I can't reconcile. Something was down there every night, breathing, having nothing to do with me. And somehow that's the worst part. Stories like this don't end when the narration stops. You carry them with you. This next account is from someone who worked an overnight shift in a cemetery that has since been absorbed into a larger property and partially redeveloped. The section in question no longer exists as it did, which, depending on what you believe about these things, is either a relief or the opposite. Story 6. The easiest way I know to tell this is to start with what I found on my last night. I need to work up to that, but that's where it ends, and that's the image I want you to hold on to while I get there. My name is Kevin. I was 27 when I took the overnight position at Greenfield Memorial in western Massachusetts. I was in a period of my life that I look back on as actively avoiding thinking. Not depression exactly, more like aggressive neutrality. I wanted simple. I wanted a routine. I wanted a job where the requirements were clear and small. Night security at a small cemetery seemed to fit. Greenfield was a mid-sized property established in the 1880s, a mix of sections from various eras. I was there in winter and early spring, which means for a lot of my shifts, the ground was either frozen or just starting to thaw. The kind of cold where your footsteps on frozen grass sound like you're walking on something fragile. The grave I need to tell you about is in the south section, which has stones from the 1890s through about 1930. The grave belongs to someone named Thomas Lyle. I don't know anything about Thomas Lyle except what his stone says. He died in 1904 at the age of 61. I noticed the disturbance early, maybe my 3rd week. Head-end disturbance, raised soil, consistent appearance between midnight and 5:30. Same as all of this. I thought, settling. I thought, animal. I logged it. What was different about Thomas Lyle's grave from the beginning was the impression the disturbance left. Every other report I've heard about similar things describes the disturbed soil as raised, lumpy, generalized. What I was finding at Thomas Lyle's grave was specific. The soil was raised, yes, but the pattern of disturbance had a shape to it that, over several mornings, I kept seeing and kept not wanting to acknowledge. The shape was hands, not perfectly formed, not theatrical, just the raised impressions in the soil at the head end of the plot had the quality of 2 hands pressed upward against a surface from below, fingers slightly spread, the areas between them depressed relative to the raised ridges, not always clearly, not always consistently, but enough that by the 4th week I stopped looking at the disturbed area in the morning and instead walked around it. And that sounds like superstition, but it wasn't superstition. It was just that I'd seen it enough. I want to tell you about the night in February that I think about the most. I was doing my 3 a.m. walk. February in western Massachusetts is as cold and clear as anywhere I've ever been. The kind of cold that feels personal, that seems to find gaps in your clothing with intention. The sky that night was exceptional, no moon, stars like holes in something. I came into the south section, Thomas Lyle's stone was lit up by my flashlight, and the soil at the head end was raised and still, and I was not going to look at the shape of it, but I looked at the shape of it. And this time, the impression wasn't in the soil. This time, it was in the frost on the surface of the stone. There were handprints on the stone, pressing outward, frost everywhere else on the stone, frost on every other surface in the cemetery. But on the flat face of Thomas Lyle's stone, there were two hand-shaped areas where the frost had melted or had never formed, and the shapes left behind were exactly as I'm describing. Two hands, pressing out, warm enough to clear the frost. I have thought about what comes after that sentence many times, what the right sentence is. I don't have one. I stood there in February at 3 a.m. in western Massachusetts in exceptional cold, and I looked at those two handprints, and my body made a decision that my brain was still processing, and the decision my body made was, walk back, now. So I did. I walked back. I logged my rounds. I made coffee. I sat in the gatehouse until 6, and then I got in my car and drove home and lay down on my bed, still in my coat. I called in sick for 3 days. When I came back, I finished my notice period, which was 2 more weeks, and I left. I didn't go to the South section in those 2 weeks. Pete, who covered weekends, never mentioned anything unusual. Maybe he didn't walk close enough. Maybe it only happened at 3 a.m. Maybe it only happened because I was the one there. I don't know what that last possibility means, and I don't pursue it. What I know is this: whatever was in that ground was warm. Warm enough to melt frost. Warm enough to leave an impression. And it had hands. That's where the story ends. Not with an explanation, just with that image. 2 handprints on a cold stone in February, melted clear. I hope Thomas Lyle found what he was pushing toward. I'm afraid he didn't. Before we go further, take a moment. If you're still here, still listening, leave a comment. Just tell me you're here. Tell me what time it is. Subscribe if you want more nights like this one. The next account is the one I've been most reluctant to read. Story 7. I keep starting this and stopping. I've typed the first sentence maybe 8 or 9 times and deleted it every time because it sounds wrong, sounds like I'm trying to make it dramatic. And it wasn't dramatic. That's the thing nobody understands when I try to explain it. It was just quiet. It was just a thing that kept happening and kept being wrong, and I kept going back anyway. My name is Renata. I worked the overnight shift at St. Anselm's Cemetery in coastal Maine, small town. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and everybody also knows not to ask too many questions about certain things. There's a culture in those old Maine communities, especially around the older properties, of leaving things alone. Don't dig. Don't ask. Don't make a case of what doesn't need to be made into a case. I grew up in that culture. I should have been better at following it. Saint. Anselm's is a Catholic cemetery, established in the 1880s, maybe 200 plots total. It's on a bluff overlooking the ocean, and in winter, the wind off the water is something you have to prepare for. It's not just cold. It has weight to it, a pressure, like it's leaning into you. I wore 2 coats every night from November through March. I took the job because the sexton, Father Dumont, he was retired clergy, not an active priest anymore, just ran the property. He knew my family and trusted me, and the pay was better than the diner where I'd been working breakfast shifts. I started in September. By the end of September, I'd noticed the grave. Far east corner, up near the stone wall. A family plot, actually. Several related stones clustered together. The one I'm talking about is a tall, narrow stone, weathered to near white, for a woman named Brigid Connelly. Died 1921. The stone has a small carved cross at the top, and beneath that, a phrase that I've looked at so many times, I can close my eyes and see it. She waits in patient hope. I first noticed the ground disturbance the 3rd week of September. Same pattern I've come to understand is consistent. Head end of the plot, soil raised, discovered at early morning walk, undisturbed at midnight. I logged it. Father Dumont came and looked and said it was probably rabbits and he'd put down some deterrent. The deterrent did nothing. By October, the disturbance was nightly and slightly larger each time. I had measured it. I'll admit I was keeping very careful notes, probably more than the job required, and it was growing at a consistent rate. By mid-October, the raised area was roughly 2 feet wide and approaching 4 feet long. The wind off the ocean on that bluff was constant, and the sound it made through the older stones was something I want to try to describe because it matters. Not a whistle, not a moan. More of a low, irregular percussion. The wind finding edges and gaps and producing something rhythmic, but not quite regular. You could hear it from anywhere on the property. You got used to it the same way you get used to any constant sound. Except that one night in late October, I was in the east corner and I realized I couldn't hear it. I was maybe 15 feet from Brigid Connelly's grave and the wind was blowing. I could feel it. I could hear it elsewhere on the property. But in that immediate area, that small pocket of space near the east wall, there was no sound. Just a low baseline hum that I slowly understood wasn't the wind at all. That was coming from below. I stopped and I listened. Low, almost below hearing. A vibration more than a sound. The kind of thing you feel in your back teeth if you're standing in the right place near certain machinery. Consistent, unchanging. It was coming from the ground beneath Brigid Connelly's stone. I will say, honestly, that I stood there for a very long time. The rest of the property had its wind sounds and its night sounds, and I was standing in this small area of not wind, feeling this vibration in my jaw, looking at a stone that said she waits in patient hope, and I was thinking about the word waits. Not past tense, present, ongoing. I went to Father Dumont the next morning and I told him about the vibration. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I've thought about since. He said, "There are some situations in which doing nothing is the correct and respectful response." Then he offered me coffee and changed the subject. I think he knew something. I don't know if he knew what specifically. But that answer, the careful specificity of it, that wasn't a dismissal. That was a position. Someone who had thought about it and arrived somewhere. I stayed. I kept doing my walks. I kept logging the disturbances. Nightly, consistent, expanding slowly. The thing that happened in November is the thing I can't get fully clear of. First week of November, my 2 a.m. walk. I was in the east corner and the hum was there, same as always, and the ground was disturbed, same as always, and I had my flashlight out and I was looking at the stone. And the inscription had changed. I know how that sounds. I know. I went back to it in daylight, and it said what it always said. She waits in patient hope. I've had daytime people at the cemetery confirm that's what it says. It has always said that. But at 2 a.m. in November, with my flashlight on it, it said something else. For one moment. And I mean a moment, the length of one breath. The light hit the carved letters at an angle, and the shadows fell differently. And what I read, what my brain processed, was not "she waits in patient hope." What I read was "she waits." Full stop, nothing after. I blinked and moved my flashlight, and it said what it always says. I know that's a trick of light. I know the shadows on the carved letters can shift with angle and produce different apparent readings. I know that. but I've thought about it every day since. The difference between those two inscriptions. She waits in patient hope. That's a burial inscription. That's comfort for the living. A promise of eventual reunion. The standard religious language of the period. She waits. That's something else. That's just a statement. That's just a fact. Unqualified, with nothing after it to soften it. I think Father Dumas knew the difference. I finished my contract in March and didn't renew. I live in the same town. I drive past St. Anselm's maybe twice a week. I don't look at the east corner when I do. There are some situations in which doing nothing is the correct and respectful response. I'm still trying to decide if he was right. The next story is quieter than this one. That doesn't make it easier. This account was shared by a woman who asked to be called Miriam. She worked cemetery security in coastal Connecticut, and she describes herself now as someone who is mostly fine about what happened. She said that 3 times in her message, which is its own kind of information. Story 8. I want to start by saying that nothing in this account is something I can prove. I know how that sounds as an opening statement, but I think it's important because a lot of what makes this hard to talk about is that every individual thing I observed had a reasonable explanation. And it's only in aggregate that the explanations stop working, and that's a difficult case to make. Individually, each thing is nothing. Together, I don't know what it is. I'm Miriam, 41. I worked at Westfield Rest Cemetery in southern Connecticut for just under a year, overnight security. The property is adjacent to an old state forest, so the east side of the cemetery backs up to about 8 miles of dense, unmanaged woodland. In summer, that woodland makes constant noise. In winter, it goes almost completely quiet, which sounds like a relief until you experience it and realize how much that constant noise was covering. The grave I'm going to tell you about belongs to a man named Hiram Ford. He died in 1898. His stone is in the oldest section of the property, near the forest boundary. A simple upright marker with a death's head carving at the top. The old Puritan style, skull and wings, which fell out of fashion after about 1780, but persisted in some rural areas longer. The death's head is fairly well preserved. I noticed the disturbance early, around the end of my 2nd month. Head end, raised soil, consistent timing. I logged it. The groundskeeper assessed it as animal activity or settling. I accepted that. What I noticed over the following weeks was more subtle than physical disturbance of the soil. I noticed that I was taking a different route through the old section. Not deliberately. I didn't decide to avoid Hiram Ford's grave. I just started noticing, after the fact, that my walk had shifted. I was going around a certain cluster of stones rather than between them, which added maybe 40 feet to that section of my route. And the result was that I passed within about 8 feet of Hiram Ford's grave instead of the usual 3 or 4. 8 feet instead of 3 or 4. My body had made that decision before I was aware it had made it. Once I noticed, I went back to my old route, walked close to the stone again. Nothing happened. Nothing was different. The disturbance was there in the mornings, same as always. The stone sat the way it sat. The carved skull on it looked the way it looked. But within a week, I had drifted back to the longer route. I want to be clear. I felt no fear near this stone, no particular dread, no hair standing up sensation. What I felt, or what I think I felt, was something more like reluctance. The specific reluctance of a person who doesn't want to make eye contact with something. The way you walk past certain things without looking directly at them, without quite deciding to do that. In January, something happened that I've described as both the most significant thing in my time there and also the most ambiguous. I was doing my 3:30 walk in the old section. Cold, still, clear. I came through the cluster of stones and came into the row where Hiram Ford's grave was, and I stopped. There was someone standing near the stone. I'm going to be precise. There was a shape near the stone that my eyes processed as a person standing, medium height, still, facing away from me, facing the stone. Dark clothing, or dark in the absence of light. I can't distinguish those. No movement. I stood about 30 feet away and I said loudly, "This is private property. The cemetery is closed." No response. No movement. I said it again. Nothing. I have thought carefully about what I did next and whether I would do it differently. I pointed my flashlight at the shape. There was no one there. Not a person that vanished when I turned the light on, more like. The shape that had registered as a person in the moment before the flashlight was not a person. It was whatever it had always been. A shadow thrown by the neighboring stones. A gap in the ambient light. Nothing that would look like a person in direct illumination. I stood there with my flashlight on the empty space near Hiram Ford's grave, and I thought about how long I had stood there, looking at what I had assessed as a person before using my flashlight. It was a long time, long enough that if it had been a person, I'd have been standing there like an idiot for a significant period. I didn't use the flashlight because some part of me didn't want to confirm it, didn't want to get a clear look. That's what I've been sitting with, not what I saw or didn't see. The fact that there was a part of me that chose, for an extended period, not to find out. I finished my notice period and left in early spring. I'm mostly fine about it, as I said. Mostly. I still catch myself doing that thing when I'm somewhere unfamiliar at night, processing shapes as presences, and then not wanting to use a light, not wanting to find out what's there and what isn't. It's just a habit. It's probably just a habit. It started at Westfield, near Hiram Ford's grave, on a cold January night when I stood 30 feet from something and held a flashlight in my hand and didn't turn it on for reasons I still can't fully name. That's the thing I'm mostly fine about. Take a breath. We've been at this a while tonight. If you're still listening and something has gotten into you, drop a comment and tell me about it. Tell me which account has been hardest to let go of, and if you're not subscribed yet. Now, maybe. More is coming, and some of it is worse than this. Story 9. I need to say up front that I know how weird this is going to sound. Not the experience. The experience is relatively consistent with others I've now heard. What sounds weird is what I did about it. What I did is the part I haven't said to anyone. My name is Paul. I'm 38. I worked overnight security at Eastbrook Cemetery in the Connecticut River Valley for almost 3 years, which is the longest I've heard of anyone staying in a job like this after noticing what I noticed. I want to explain why I stayed so long, because I think it's part of the story. Eastbrook is in central Massachusetts, inland, in a valley that holds cold air in the winter, like a bowl holds water. Fog in that valley from October through April most mornings, the kind that sits low to the ground and makes the stones look like they're floating. I thought it was beautiful for about the first month. After that, I stopped thinking about it. The grave is in the middle section of the property, which dates to around 1870 to 1910. The stone belongs to a man named Ezra Bowen. He died in 1889 at age 44. The stone is a nice one for the period, has a carved book at the top, open book meant to represent scripture, and is in better shape than most of its neighbors. I noticed the disturbance 4 months in and went through all the expected stages: rational explanation, logging, maintenance assessment, continued disturbance, further logging, continued disturbance. By month 6, I had accepted that it was going to happen every night, and that the maintenance team's assessment was not going to change, and that this was now just part of my relationship with that property. I want to be honest. Something in me was. I want to use the word interested. That's not quite right, but it's the closest I have. I wasn't frightened of it. I found myself curious in a way that the job gave me ample time to pursue. I started researching Ezra Bowen, the county records office, old newspapers digitized by a local historical society, cemetery records that Father Anselm, the property's administrator, let me look through after I explained my interest as historical rather than morbid. What I found was not dramatic. He was a farmer. He had a wife, 3 children, 2 of whom survived infancy. He is described in one newspaper account from 1887 as a man of orderly habits and reliable character. He died of what the death record lists as a failure of the heart, which in that era could mean many things. He was buried in the plot where his stone stands. There's no record of disturbance or irregularity in the burial. He went into the ground and stayed there the way people do. And yet, the thing I did that I haven't told anyone is this. I started talking to him. Not dramatic conversations, not Ouija board invocations. Just quiet. Standing at a reasonable distance from his stone on my early morning walk. Not every night, but regularly, from about the 8th month on. I would say something like, "I'm still here, still walking the grounds. Things are quiet tonight," that kind of thing. Mundane, the things you'd say to someone you check in with out of habit. I know how that sounds. I'm 48 years old, and I was standing in a valley fog at 4 a.m. talking to a dead farmer, and I'm telling you this in an anonymous account, because I'm not ready to say it with my name attached. But here is what I need to tell you. The disturbances continued throughout my time there, nightly, consistent, gradually intensifying in scale. The stone worked progressively looser from the surrounding ground until by year 2, you could see daylight around its base when you got close. Except on the nights after I had talked to him. On those mornings, the disturbance was smaller, sometimes significantly smaller, not absent, still there, still logged, but measurably reduced. I know this because I was logging measurements. I can't make a case for what that means. I can't tell you whether the correlation means anything or whether I wanted it to mean something and invented the correlation in my measurements. I genuinely don't know. But after year 2, I started talking to him more often than most nights, and the disturbances stayed within a consistent range rather than continuing to intensify the way they had been. I left after year 3 because I got a better job offer elsewhere, and because there is a limit to how long a person can do any one thing. On my last night, I stood at Ezra Bowen's stone for a long time. I said, "I'm leaving." I said, "I hope things go easier for you." I don't know what that means as a sentence. I said it anyway. I drove away from Eastbrook at 6:15 in the morning with the valley fog still sitting low over the graves, and I thought about a man of orderly habits and reliable character who had been in the ground since 1889 and was still every night doing whatever he was doing down there, with the consistency and the patience that implies. A person like that might appreciate being spoken to. That's what I thought, whatever he was. Whatever was happening in that ground. It had been doing it for a very long time, and probably no one had ever acknowledged it. I hope he is less restless now. I don't have any reason to think that, and every reason to not think it, and I hope it anyway. That's the whole story. That's the part I hadn't told. If this feels too familiar, you're not alone in that feeling. The next account is one that was sent to me with an unusual request. The person who wrote it asked me to read it exactly as written and not to editorialize. They said the facts were the facts and they didn't need me adding to them. I've honored that. The next story is quieter than this one. That doesn't make it easier. Story 10. I've been putting off telling this one because of how it ends. Most of what I've experienced I can describe and hold at a distance. This one I can't hold at the same distance. This one I'm still standing inside of, in a way. I'm Carolyn. I'm 34. I work nights at Hillcrest Memorial Gardens in southern Massachusetts for about 16 months. It's a larger property than most in this area. Close to 500 plots, and they had 2 overnight staff. My coworker was a man named Harold who was 67, retired, doing the job for pocket money and because his wife had died and he couldn't sleep in the house alone. Harold and I overlapped for the first 3 months. Then he retired fully and I was alone, and the property management decided one overnight person was sufficient, and that's when things changed. I was not alone in the way that you're used to by then, in the second job. I'd adjusted to the work, to the dark, to the quiet. I thought I'd adjusted to all of it. The grave is in the new section, which in cemetery terms means from the 1950s to 1970s. The stone is a standard granite rectangle, laid flat, polished. The name is Richard Calloway. He died in 1967 at age 38. What made this different from the accounts you've heard right from the start was the timing. The disturbance at Richard Calloway's grave didn't follow the standard pattern. It didn't happen consistently between midnight and 5 a.m. It happened at different times on different nights. Some nights it had happened by midnight. Some nights it wasn't there until almost 5. And some nights, maybe 1 in 4, it hadn't happened at all. That irregularity was the first thing that made me uncomfortable. The other accounts I've now heard all describe something with a schedule, a rhythm. This didn't have that. The irregularity felt more like attention than routine. I don't know how else to say it. A thing with a routine is doing what it does. A thing without a consistent routine is responding to something. I started noticing the irregularity in month 3. I started correlating in month 4. And what I found, what I cannot fully explain and cannot stop thinking about, is that the nights when the disturbance was absent were always the nights when I had walked close to the stone on my midnight round. On those nights, nothing in the morning. On nights when I'd stayed at standard distance or bypassed that section, the disturbance was present. Let me say that clearly. When I went closer, nothing happened. When I stayed away, it did. I tested this. I hate that I tested it, but I did. Several times over the following months, I deliberately altered my walk to approach very close to Richard Calloway's stone on my midnight round, close enough to touch it. And on those mornings, the ground was undisturbed, and on nights when I stayed back, disturbed, as if whatever was happening there was happening because I wasn't present for it, as if the presence of a person standing close was stopping it, or as if it only happened when no one was watching. The last night I worked at Hillcrest, I stood at Richard Calloway's stone for about 20 minutes around midnight, my hand on the stone, cold granite under my palm. I said out loud, "I'm leaving. Tomorrow night someone else will be here, and they probably won't know to stand close. I don't know what that means for you. I'm sorry, I don't." I drove home at 6 a.m. and handed in my resignation that afternoon. I don't know what happened to Richard Calloway. I don't know what he was doing in the ground at night, or why it stopped when someone stood near him, or what I was providing by standing there. Presence, witness, some kind of company that mattered to whatever was left of him. The thing I can't settle, he was 38 when he died, younger than I am now, and for a long time, possibly a very long time, he'd been doing whatever that was, alone, every night, and it stopped when someone was close enough that he could feel them there. That's the thing that lives in me now, not the horror of it, The loneliness of it. If I'd known sooner what I was providing just by standing there, I'd have stood there every night. I didn't know. I don't know what that cost him. I hope it cost him nothing. I'm afraid it didn't cost him nothing. The final account was sent to me only recently. The person asked for no name, no identifying details. All they said was, I worked the night shift, and I need someone to know this happened. Story 11. I don't know how to start this, so I'm just going to start. The cemetery was in western Connecticut. The grave was in the east section. I worked there for 7 months, and I will not work somewhere like that again. The name on the stone was James Ellery. He died in 1891 at age 59. I know almost nothing else about him except what you can infer from a grave in that era. Probably farmed or worked a trade, probably Protestant, probably a family nearby, though I found no wife or children buried in adjacent plots. The disturbance started in my first week, not the first morning. The first week, earlier than anyone else I've heard describe, which means whatever was happening there had either recently started or it recognized something quickly. I don't know which of those options is less troubling. The disturbance grew rapidly. Within a month, it covered the full footprint of the plot. Within 6 weeks, the stone was tilted. The marks I found on the lower section of the stone, the part closest to the ground, were consistent with what someone named Agnes Wren's stone is reported to have: parallel lines at narrow intervals, the kind left by something dragged slowly across a surface with intent. What made my experience different from what I've heard was sound. From very early on, 3rd week maybe, I was hearing it. Not the breathing sound described at one site or the vibration described at another. What I was hearing was percussion, slow, deliberate, irregular. The sound of something solid striking another solid surface from below. Not frantic, never frantic. Just a knock, a pause, another knock. Spaced out, a minute apart, sometimes 2, sometimes 30 seconds. No detectable pattern. Just an ongoing series of knocks from below the surface of James Ellery's grave. I reported this. I said I was hearing sounds that might indicate an animal burrowing. The administrator came and listened and heard nothing, which was accurate. In daylight, on a standard site visit, it was silent. It was never anything but silent in daylight. At night, the knocking continued. I want to be precise about what it sounded like because I think precision matters. It sounded like someone knocking on a door, not desperately, not hammering, just knocking. The way a person knocks when they expect to be heard and are prepared to wait to be answered. I thought about that a lot. Knocking implies expectation. You knock because you believe there is someone on the other side who could open the door. You knock because you have not given up on the possibility of the door opening. I worked there for 7 months. For 7 months every night, James Ellery knocked. I never answered. That's the thing. That's the part I think about now. I never once went and put my hand on that stone, or spoke toward the ground, or in any way responded to a sound that was, by any human standard, a request for acknowledgement. I logged it, I measured it, I documented it, and I never responded. I don't know what I was protecting myself from by not responding. I don't know what I was afraid would happen if I answered. But I also don't know. I can't know what happens when someone knocks for 7 months and nobody comes. Does it stop? Do they stop? Or do they just keep going? I walked out of that job on a Tuesday morning in April, got in my car, and drove away from James Ellery's grave, and his stone, and his knocking. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't answer. Some nights now, I'm in a quiet room, and I hear something in the walls, just the house settling, and I count the intervals between sounds. Irregular. A minute, sometimes 2, sometimes 30 seconds. I don't think the house is settling. I think I brought something home with me. I think I was the only person who ever heard it. And when I left, it had nowhere else to go, and now it knows where I am. I don't have anything to add to that. I needed someone to know that it happened. All of these people worked the same hours in places most people drive past without looking. All of them noticed something. All of them came home eventually, resumed their lives, filed their paperwork, moved on in the ways people move on. And every one of them is still listening for something, in the walls, in the quiet between sounds, in the dark at the back of a room at 3 a.m, not looking for it. Just aware, in the specific way these things make you aware, that the ground holds more than we put into it, and that whatever we put in doesn't always stay still. You're in the dark right now, or close to it, and somewhere, in a cemetery you've never visited in a state you might never go to, a stone sits slightly tilted from its original seating. The ground around it is disturbed, and whatever is underneath it is doing what it does, the way it does every night. It doesn't know you're listening. But you know it's there. Sleep well.